Hi guys, Mimi G here. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing a sew along for my winter pattern Simplicity 9687. I love this pattern and I cannot wait to get started. Today we're going to start with View B, the poncho. Now if you just need a refresher, I have a sewing basics video linked in the description box below. You can watch that, then come back and sew along with me. Now because this is not a learn to sew video, if you need further explanation, let me teach you by joining sewacademy.com, where I teach you how to sew from the very beginning and each course builds on the next. I even have a free trial where you can join, and the first 5 courses are completely free, no credit card required. Let's get started. Okay, so you're gonna need pattern 9687. We're gonna start with View B, which is the poncho. On the back of the envelope, however, you always have a list of suggested fabrics for each piece that we're making. Also a list of any notions you're gonna need. So for this poncho that we're gonna be doing, I suggest using a heavyweight fabric like a wool. That would be really great. You're gonna need a 9-inch zipper. You're also gonna need some bias binding and some heavy duty snaps. Now let's go over the pattern pieces you need to cut. All right guys, so you're gonna cut out pattern piece number 13. This is our collar. You're gonna cut 2 on the fold of fabric and you're gonna cut 1 on the fold of interfacing. So I'm just gonna mention this now because you'll probably notice it while I'm sewing. I'm using a pretty heavyweight wool, so I am not going to be interfacing my collar, but if you're using a lighter weight wool or any other fabric that is not super heavy, then you will want to interface your collar. Then you're gonna cut out pattern piece number 11. This is the front. You're gonna cut 1 on the fold. Make sure that you transfer your markings and your dots because we are gonna be adding a zipper. Then you're gonna cut out pattern piece number 12. This is the back and you're gonna cut it on the fold. That's it, 3 pieces. Now once you have everything cut out and your collar interfaced, we can get started. Okay, so we're working on the front piece. Now on the back at the end of your markings, you should have interfaced a little square. I'm using black interfacing because my fabric is black. Also, I wanted to point out that I have decided to serge my shoulders down the side and the bottom before putting my poncho together. So you do have that option as well. I find that it's easier. Now I have gone ahead and stitched following my guidelines. So you should have transferred that box, right? That long box onto your fabric, and you're going to stitch right along those lines. Now we're gonna go ahead and cut down, but not all the way to the bottom. We're gonna cut diagonally at the corners, making sure not to cut through our stitches. Okay, so I'm gonna use my rotary cutter. I'm gonna start cutting right along the center and I'm gonna stop about 1/2 inch before I reach the bottom. Now using my scissors, you're gonna cut diagonally into the corners, but make sure you don't cut through your stitches. Now, depending on your fabric, you may or may not be able to press this, but go ahead and try and press along your stitching lines. So I've gone ahead and pressed along my stitching lines, and we can adjust that as we're attaching our zipper a little later on. So go ahead and get your back piece. We're gonna place them right sides facing, and we're gonna go ahead and stitch our shoulders together. Now, because my fabric is so thick, that's the reason I chose to serge prior to sewing this together. That way I could press my seams open and it'll be nice and neat. If I serge them together, then it would be just a tad bit bulky for me. So go ahead and pin your other shoulder front to back the same way, and then using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're just gonna sew a straight line, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. All right, if you did interface your collar, one of your collar pieces, then that's the one that you're gonna be using. Remember, I did not interface mine, but I'm working with a really heavy wool. So if you did interface it, that's the collar piece that you're using right now. We're gonna go ahead and pin this to our neckline, and you should have transferred your dots. These dots are gonna match up to your shoulder seams. So we're gonna go ahead and pin. I'm gonna pin first, matching my shoulder seams to my dots. Now for the front, you're gonna go ahead and open out that little pressed edge along the front because your edges should be butting up against each other. Okay, now we're gonna head to the sewing machine and you're gonna stitch your collar onto your neckline using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so it tells us to go ahead and trim our seam allowance, but when I'm using heavy fabric like this, I generally don't clip or trim both of my seam allowances. What I generally do is I trim 1 just to reduce bulk, because I find that if I cut 2, then I just have a really short, sort of thick seam allowance, and I don't always like the way that looks on the right side of my fabric. So because we're gonna be pressing our seam allowance up towards the collar, I'm gonna leave the bottom one without being trimmed, and instead I'm gonna trim the one that you're not gonna see once we press this up. So I'm gonna trim about half of this down to 1/4 of an inch. Okay, now I want you to go ahead and press this seam allowance up towards your collar. All right, we're gonna go ahead and work on our zipper. So you're gonna go ahead and just lightly pull out the pressed edges. I want you to start with your zipper open, but with the wrong side of the zipper facing down. Okay, so this is the wrong side, this is the right side of the zipper. I want it facing down. So you're looking at the back of your zipper. You're gonna go ahead and pin your zipper tape to the edge of your fabric, right? So you're gonna just basically line up your zipper with the edge of your opening. And we're gonna go ahead and pin. Okay, so once you have it pinned, you're gonna go ahead and stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge. Okay, so that's gonna be your allowance, is 1/4 inch from the edge. Okay, so once you have your one side of your zipper tape sewn, go ahead and turn it to the right side. Before we stitch the other side, I want to make sure that my seam line here with the collar is exactly going to be in the same place on the other side. And when you're sewing a zipper, things tend to shift. So I like to just make a marking on my zipper tape. That way I know that when I'm pinning my other side, because you're gonna do the same exact thing to the other side. You're gonna make sure that you pin exactly where that seam line is and the marking, so that when you sew this, they're gonna be in exactly the same place. Okay, so once they're both attached and you close your zipper, your seam lines should be in exactly the same place. Now the only thing we have left to do is close out the bottom of our zipper. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn this to the other side so I could see it. So you should have this little folded triangle here, and you have your stitching line. So you're just gonna go right over your stitching line. Now, if you're using a metal zipper like I am, you might just wanna use your hand wheel to turn this, because you will break your needle, or you can also hand stitch this through this little area here if you don't wanna use your sewing machine. If you're using a plastic coiled zipper, then you could probably sew through this. Just go very slow. All right, guys, so now we're gonna go ahead and work on the other piece of our collar. So we're gonna be attaching bias binding. So before you attach your bias binding, I've gone ahead and made a stitching line for myself at 5/8 of an inch. It was a little hard for you guys to see because I'm using black fabric and I know it's hard to see, so I apologize in advance, child. So because you can't see it, I went ahead and just went over my stitching line with my chalk pencil so that you guys can sort of see. What you want to do is you want to open out one end of your bias binding, and you're going to go ahead and pin the folded edge along your 5/8 of an inch seam. So that's why I mark it, because it's just easier for me to be able to see it. So I'm going to open this like this, right? Because we're going to fold eventually and then fold it down. So I'm going to make sure that the folded edge of my bias tape is on my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm just going to go ahead and pin. And you'll notice that your fabric should be extending a bit more than your bias tape if you're placing it correctly. Okay, so because you placed that folded edge of your bias along your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance line, you can go ahead and stitch this down following the crease in your bias. Okay, so you're gonna go ahead and trim this seam allowance, that's the fabric and your bias tape, down to about 1/4 inch. Okay, now go ahead and press your bias binding down. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and pin the remaining piece of our collar. So you're gonna go ahead and make sure that isn't still folded in, okay? You wanna open this out. You're gonna go ahead and place it so that the edges are meeting, and go ahead and pin. And then continue pinning the remainder of your collar along the top and then down the front of the other side of the zipper. Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and stitch this. What I want you to do is I want you to fold up the remaining part of your bias when you stitch this down, okay? So your bias should not be opened. Now for the front edge where our zipper is, we're only using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But for the top, we're gonna use 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then on the other side, again, make sure that you turn your bias to up towards your collar, pin, and then again, only a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the front. Okay, wanna make sure that you cut into your corners before you turn this right side out. Okay, now go ahead and press your collar to the inside, and you have two options. You can base this or hand stitch this closed, right? Or you can press it, pin it, and stitch in the ditch, which is usually what I do. So go ahead and press your collar to the inside. Okay, so I have it all pinned. You'll notice that my pins are on the right side of my garment because I want to be able to sew on the right side. I've pinned my entire bias on the inside. So you actually have two options because you could just stitch in the ditch if you don't want any visible stitching. But if you want some top stitching, you can, because your bias tape is going to extend past your seam line, you can go ahead and do like a 1/4 inch top stitch. That would look really nice. And then you can go ahead if you'd like and top stitch here as well. It really depends on the look that you're going for. I want a cleaner, sleeker look, so I'm not going to have any visible top stitching on mine. I'm just going to go ahead and stitch in the ditch. All right, once your collar is done, we're going to go ahead and mark off the 2-inch seam allowance that we're going to be, or hem allowance, I'm sorry, for the bottom, the back, and the sides. So what we're going to do is we're going to first sew our hem in place for the front, and we're going to sew our hem in place for the back, and then you do the sides. Now if you want to do mitered corners, you can do mitered corners, but I'm just going to do it the way that the instructions show in case that's what you're following. So we have a 2-inch hem allowance. So what I'm going to do is on the right side of my fabric, since I'm using a chalk and I can easily remove it, I'm going to go ahead and mark using my 2-inch wide ruler so that I can press it exactly, using sort of this as a guide. I'm going to do the same thing to my front and to the sides. Then I want you to go ahead and press it. Now if you're using a fabric that is lighter, like let's say you're not using a heavyweight wool like I am, then you have the option to turn in the 1/4 inch and then fold along that 2-inch so that you have a super clean finish. I'm using a relatively heavy wool, so I'm gonna try it, but if it's too bulky for me and I don't like it, then I'm just gonna let it out since I've already serged all the way around the garment. All right, I've gone ahead and pressed all the way around my 2-inch allowance. What you're gonna do first is you're gonna stitch along the bottom of the back, you're gonna stitch along the bottom of the front, and then I want you to turn your sides and finish off the sides. Okay guys, so once you have gone ahead and finished all the hemming, the only thing left for you to do is to add your snaps. One goes here on each of your markings, and then on the other side, it does snap flat the way that you see it here. And you're gonna use the instructions that are on whatever package of snaps you've chosen to use. Once you're done with that, you are all finished. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this sew along. Please make sure and tag and follow me on Instagram if you're not doing so already, @MimiGStyle. I love to see your guys' makes. Until next time, peace.